Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're kicking off a brand new series. It's based on Joseph Schumpeter's, this huge piece of work, 10 Great Economists.
It's a fantastic way to approach intellectual history.
I think so too. We're trying to understand how one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century saw the people who, completely changed how we think about economics and politics.
And Schumpeter's the perfect guide. I mean, he wasn't just an economist. He was this profound historian of ideas. He was an Austrian, a staunch defender of capitalism.
Right, the guy who championed the entrepreneur.
Exactly. His whole thing was the dynamism of markets. So that makes his take on our first subject, Karl Marx, capitalism's greatest and, let's face it, most controversial critic, absolutely essential listening.
That really sets up the core question for us and for you listening. So, welcome to our new series. We begin with the most controversial figure in economics. What did Schumpeter, a defender of capitalism, really think about its greatest critic, Karl Marx?
And it's a relationship that's all about intellectual rigor. It's not about politics. Schumpeter's whole approach is one of brilliant, almost.
Cynical.
Clinical impartiality, yes. He insists that you have to look at what Marx built, this incredible structure, and judge the achievement on its own terms. It doesn't matter if you think it's a source of light or, and I love this phrase he uses, a power of darkness.
That framework is so useful. It lets us cut through all the noise, all the ideology that surrounds Marx. We're not talking about communism or the Soviet Union.
Oh.
We are just talking about a body of work. So our mission today is to take Marx's huge, almost overwhelming system, especially Das Kapital, and break it down using Schumpeter's blueprint.
And it's a brilliant blueprint. He gives us this perfect tool for the job. He splits Marx's contribution, his whole persona, really, into 4 different roles.
Sure.
Marx the prophet, Marx the sociologist, Marx the economist, and finally Marx the teacher.
And by using those 4 lenses, we get a much, much clearer picture. We can see where Schumpeter had this profound respect for his historical analysis, but at the same time, we can see where he applies this. Just devastating technical criticism to his economic theory.
It's really the best shortcut to getting a handle on a thinker that, everyone has an opinion on, but very few people have actually grappled with.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start with the source of his global power, the part that's lasted the longest. Marx the prophet. So when Schumpeter calls Marx a prophet, he's not just being poetic. He means it in a very specific way. He's saying Marxism is more than an ideology. He compares it, amazingly, he compares it to a religion.
He does. And that analogy is completely central to his argument because for the true believer, Marxism does exactly what a religion does. It fills the same psychological needs.
How so?
Well, it gives you a complete system of ultimate ends. It provides absolute standards to judge good and evil in society. It explains why the world is full of suffering and injustice, and this is the most important part, it offers a guaranteed path to salvation.
But, and this is the crucial difference, that salvation isn't in the afterlife. It's a paradise on this side of the grave.
Precisely. It takes that fundamental human need for meaning, for justice, for a final positive end to all the suffering, and it grounds it in a system that claims to be completely materialistic and rational.
So it's emotionally satisfying, but also intellectually absolute.
Exactly. That's the source of its incredible power. It appeals to both the heart and the head.
But, there were other socialists before Marx, the utopian socialists. They had visions of paradise, too. Why did their ideas kind of fizzle out while Marx's message just exploded?
Schumpeter is really clear on this. The success came from what he calls its perceived scientific achievement. Marx took incredible pains to frame the socialist goal not as just a nice idea or a moral preference.
Or wishful thinking.
Or wishful thinking, right. He presented it as a historical certainty, something you could prove rationally, almost mathematically.
So the real engine driving it is this feeling of inevitability. The sense that you're not just fighting for a political cause, you're on the right side of history's iron laws.
You've got it. Think about the time, the 19th century. It was an age obsessed with science, with evolution, with mechanistic progress. So framing it this way was a stroke of genius. It meant you couldn't just dismiss Marxism as, a fairy tale for the poor.
It had intellectual weight.
It had serious intellectual weight. And that scientific commitment leads to something Schumpeter finds really surprising about Marx. his total lack of sentimentality about the working class?
Yeah, that's a key point. He didn't idealize them.
Not at all. He wasn't basing his whole system on how good or noble the proletariat were, the way some of the utopians did. His focus was, you could say, ruthlessly objective. He just wanted to prove the inevitability of socialism by analyzing the cold, hard facts of production and social evolution.
So he wasn't arguing capitalism is evil, so we must have socialism. He was arguing capitalism, because of how it works, will create socialism. The morality was almost beside the point. It was all about the structural necessity.
And that approach gives the whole project a kind of a rigor, a seriousness. Schumpeter saw this as one of the reasons Marx's ideas have had such a long life. He was playing a much bigger game than just writing slogans.
And there's another paradox here that Schumpeter points out, something that really shows Marx's intellectual breadth. For all his criticism of capitalism, he actually understood and even admired what the bourgeoisie had achieved historically.
This is one of the most astonishing parts, and it's something that gets lost in today's debates. Marx wasn't blind to the immense creative power of capitalism. I mean, you read the Communist Manifesto, and he writes with a sense of awe about what the bourgeoisie accomplished.
Right, he says they were the first class in history to show what human activity could really do.
They built these massive cities, they connected the world with trade, they pulled millions of people out of what he called the idiocy of rural life, and they built wonders.
And Schumpeter points this out, right? He says Marx compared these achievements, the factories, the global markets, to the pyramids and the Roman aqueducts.
Yes. For Marx, the bourgeoisie was a necessary progressive force. They had to create all this wealth, all this productive power to set the stage for the next phase of history. He wasn't saying capitalism was weak, quite the opposite.
He was saying it was so successful.
So incredibly powerful and successful that it literally created the tools for its own destruction, that its own engine of production, as Schumpeter puts it, carried its own pro futuro death sentence.
So, to sum up Marx the prophet, he created this quasi-religious message of salvation, but he wrapped it in the language of science and objectivity. And he did it all while fully acknowledging the power of the very system he was trying to bring down.
That's it, exactly. It was a structural critique, not a sentimental one. And that structure is what we need to look at now in the roles Schumpeter admired most. Marx the sociologist.
Okay, so we've seen that the power of Marx's message was its claim to be scientific. Now we get to the actual framework that was supposed to provide that science. Marx the sociologist. And this is where Schumpeter's tone really shifts.
It absolutely does. He sees this as the core of Marx's lasting contribution. He says these sociological insights are incredibly valuable, even if you throw out all the specific economic predictions.
The foundation is that strong.
It's robust. For Schumpeter, the way Marx analyzed how economic systems create social structures, that was profound. And it stands on its own, whether or not the economic math he used to connect the dots was right.
And the central idea here, the big one, is the economic interpretation of history. The EIH, it's a term people throw around a lot, but it's usually misunderstood as just crude materialism.
It is, and Schumpeter immediately clears up the biggest misconception. The EIH is not the idea that people are only motivated by money or greed.
Right.
Marx knew that was ridiculous. He knew people are driven by religion, patriotism, love, honor, all sorts of non-economic things. That's not what he meant.
So if it's not about what's in our heads or individual motives, what is the EIH about?
It's a proposition about the structure of society itself. It's the idea that the forms or conditions of production, so the technology we use, how we organize work, the economic structure, that these things are the fundamental driver of everything else.
Everything else.
Everything else. Our social classes, our political systems, our laws, our culture, our very way of thinking.
So it's not about individual psychology, it's about the infrastructure.
Yeah.
How a society feeds and clothes itself determines how that society has to be organized.
It's a deeply deterministic view. And Schumpeter brings up the perfect, simple illustration that Marx himself used.
The hand mill and the steam mill.
Exactly. The hand mill gives you feudal society with its lords and serfs. The steam mill gives you industrial capitalist society with its factory owners and wage laborers.
That's a powerful analogy. But it brings up a huge question, especially for Schumpeter. If the technology dictates the social structure, where does that leave human choice? Where does it leave the entrepreneur, the disruptive genius that Schumpeter put at the center of his own theory?
That's a great point. I think Schumpeter saw it as a difference in focus. Marx's EIH is about the logic of the system's evolution, not the individual's motivation. For Marx, the technology itself, what he called the propeller, has its own momentum. Once the steam mill becomes possible, society has to reorganize itself around it to use it efficiently.
You can't run a giant factory using a feudal manor system.
You can't. You need cities, you need a mobile workforce you can hire and fire, you need capital markets. The technology demands a new social structure. Society doesn't so much choose it as it's forced to adapt.
And that idea of an internal engine of change must have appealed to Schumpeter, even if he disagreed on the mechanics.
Absolutely. From this EIH, Marx then logically develops his theory of social classes. And Schumpeter says this was a major contribution because economists before Marx had been weirdly blind to the importance of social class as a rigid, defining feature of the economy.
And Marx's definition of class follows straight from his main principle.
It does. It's not about how much money you have. It's about your relationship to the means of production. You either own the factories, the land, the capital, so you're a capitalist, or you don't, and your only asset is your ability to work. You're the proletariat.
A very clean, simple division.
Almost too simple. And that's where Schumpeter finds a major problem. He says that while the concept of class is vital, Marx oversimplified society into this strict two-class binary, owners versus workers.
Why did he do that?
Well, he had to. For his revolutionary theory to work, he needed a sharp, escalating conflict between two clearly defined opposing camps. If you admit that society is actually this messy, complex thing with lots of intermediate groups,
Like managers, small business owners, professionals, clerks.
all of them, if you have all those people, then the pure two-way antagonism that's supposed to tear society apart gets diluted. It's not as clear-cut.
So the sociological theory required him to simplify the messy reality. He basically ignored the middle class because it got in the way of the revolutionary formula.
That's the argument. He needed to show that everyone was eventually going to be forced into one camp or the other, that society was polarizing.
And this leads to Schumpeter's second big critique of Marx the sociologist. Not just the oversimplification of class, but the exaggeration of class antagonism.
Yes. Schumpeter says, look, of course there's class conflict, but Marx blows it out of proportion. In the real world, there's also a huge amount of cooperation, what Schumpeter calls synagogism groups working together, or at least just coexisting peacefully. That's actually far more common day-to-day than open struggle.
But if you have more cooperation and a big middle class with a stake in the system, then the whole idea of an inevitable violent collapse starts to look a lot less inevitable.
It slows the whole process down, maybe indefinitely. Marx needed that constant high-stakes conflict to keep the engine of his theory running toward the breaking point.
But even with those big criticisms, Schumpeter's admiration for the overall vision is unshaken.
It is. He says the sheer historical and sociological sweep of Marx's work was unprecedented. He didn't just paint with a broad brush, he backed it up with mountains of historical detail. He set a new standard. For Schumpeter, the economic interpretation of history, even with its flaws, remains Marx's greatest contribution.
All right, so we've covered the prophet and the sociologist, where Schumpeter found a lot to admire. Now we have to pivot to the area where his judgment is. Well, it's pretty brutal. Let's talk about Marx the economist.
Yeah, this is where the tone changes completely. Schumpeter really doesn't pull any punches here. He acknowledges that Marx was this incredibly learned man, a voracious reader who knew everything. But in terms of pure economic theory, the technical stuff, Schumpeter is blunt. He says Marx was basically just a pupil of Ricardo.
So not an original thinker in economics.
Not a genius in pure economics, no. He was using the tools that were available to him from classical economists like David Ricardo and just adapting them for his own project.
And the main tool he borrowed, the one that the whole thing rests on, is the labor theory of value, the LTV.
Exactly. The LTV is the analytical engine inside the machine of Das Kapital. At its core, the idea is that in a state of perfect competition, the value of any product is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time it took to make it.
It sounds simple enough. A table that takes 10 hours to make should be worth twice as much as a chair that takes 5 hours. But Schumpeter says this theory is, in his words, unsatisfactory. Why? What are the big flaws?
Well, for the LTV to work, it needs two conditions that are just. They're not very realistic. The first is that you need universal, perfect competition.
Which we know isn't how capitalism really works. It tends towards monopolies and oligopolies.
Right. But Schumpeter says the really fatal flaw is the second condition, and that is the assumption that labor is the only factor of production that creates value.
What about the machines, the raw materials, the factory building itself?
Exactly. The moment you admit that capital, the machinery, the tools also contributes to the final product, the whole LTV falls apart. Because if you have two products that take the same amount of labor, but one requires a hugely expensive machine and the other doesn't, they won't sell for the same price. The simple one-to-one link between labor time and value is broken.
And if the LTV doesn't work technically, then Marx's biggest, most explosive concept, surplus value, it loses its scientific foundation.
It does. But let's be clear about how surplus value, or Mehrwert, works, because Schumpeter still found the concept itself powerful, even if the math behind it was shaky.
Okay, let's break it down.
So surplus value is Marx's theory of exploitation, and the genius of it is that he says exploitation doesn't happen because the capitalist is a bad guy who cheats his workers. It's built into the system. It comes from the difference between two things, labor and labor power.
A really crucial distinction.
It's everything. Labor power is what the worker sells. It's their ability to work for a day. The price of that, the wage, is determined by how much it costs to keep the worker alive and able to work another day. Food, rent, clothes.
The cost of reproducing the labor power?
Precisely. But what the capitalist gets is the worker's actual labor for the entire day. So let's say the worker's wage covers what they can produce in 4 hours, but the workday is 8 hours long.
So those extra 4 hours.
Those extra 4 hours are unpaid labor. The value created in that time is the surplus value, which the capitalist keeps as profit.
And Schumpeter points out that for Marx, this isn't theft. It's just the logical result of the wage contract in a capitalist system.
Yes. It's structural, not personal. It happens because of the very logic of the capitalist system, whether the factory owner is a saint or a monster. That's what made the critique so powerful and, so scientific sounding.
Okay, moving from the static theory to the dynamics, what about the theory of accumulation and concentration? Schumpeter gives Marx some credit here. Okay.
He does. He says Marx had a major insight. He saw that capitalism could never stand still. It was defined by constant change, and he correctly predicted the tendency toward concentration, that companies would get bigger and bigger, leading to monopolies. A lot of other economists at the time missed that.
Marx saw that capitalists are forced to reinvest their surplus value to expand, or they'll be crushed by their competitors, accumulate or die.
Right. But this is also where Schumpeter lands another huge criticism, this time on the mechanics of how that accumulation happens. He says Marx has no real theory of the entrepreneur.
Which, for Schumpeter, is like having a theory of evolution with no theory of mutation.
Perfect analogy. Marx's model is mostly about existing capitalists fighting over market share, trying to cut costs, making their existing processes more efficient. It's about quantitative expansion.
But he misses the qualitative leaps.
He completely misses the disruptive creation of new commodities or new methods of production. He doesn't see innovation as this force of what Schumpeter would later call creative destruction, where a whole new technology or business model just makes the old way of doing things obsolete.
So Marx saw competition as a grim fight to the death on a single battlefield, while Schumpeter saw it as innovators constantly creating entirely new battlefields.
Exactly, and that oversight makes Marx's whole theory of how capitalism develops feel too mechanical, too deterministic, and ultimately not dynamic enough.
And this flawed engine of accumulation leads directly to his biggest prediction, the breakdown theory, the Zusammenbruch theory, the final, inevitable collapse of capitalism.
Yes, the grand finale. The logic is supposed to go like this. Accumulation leads to more and more machines, which creates a surplus population of unemployed workers, which leads to growing misery, which ultimately causes the whole system to crash.
And this relies on two so-called laws he came up with, the falling rate of profit and increasing misery. Let's take the first one. Why did Marx think profits had to fall over time?
Okay, so he divides capital into two types. Constant capital is the machines and raw materials. Variable capital is the wages paid to workers. According to his LTV, only variable capital, only labor, creates new value and surplus value.
So as capitalists invest more and more in machines to compete,
the proportion of constant capital goes up, and the proportion of variable capital, the source of all profit, goes down. So the rate of profit on the total investment has to fall in the long run. They are, ironically, investing their way into oblivion.
but Schumpeter says this is just wrong.
He says it's untenable. For one thing, new technology can be so productive that it massively increases the rate of surplus value extraction, counteracting the trend. And even more importantly, he attacks the other pillar, the law of increasing misery, or immiseration.
The idea that the working class will get poorer and poorer.
Yes. Marx believed the industrial reserve army of the unemployed would always keep wages at subsistence level. But Schumpeter just points to the data.
And the data showed
The opposite. In the late 19th century, real wages were going up, working hours were going down, and the general standard of living for the masses was improving, not getting worse. Marx's prediction of absolute misery was just empirically false.
So last piece of the economic puzzle.
Yeah.
What about business cycles? Crises.
Marx was obsessed with crises, like the big one in 1847. Schumpeter gives him credit for seeing that these booms and busts were an inherent part of capitalism, not just an accident. He was ahead of the curve there.
Another but.
He didn't have a coherent theory of why they happened. And worse, he tended to confuse these normal cyclical downturns with the signs of the final, ultimate breakdown of the entire system.
He mistook the flu for a terminal illness.
That's a perfect way to put it. He saw every recession as proof that the end was nigh. So the final verdict from Schumpeter on Marx the Economist is just brutal. The tools are borrowed and faulty, the logic is flawed, and the predictions are wrong.
Which brings us to the grand finale, the synthesis of it all. Marx the teacher. This is where we have to put the prophet, the sociologist, and the economist back together and see how they work as a single system.
Right. And Schumpeter's point is that for a true Marxist, you can't just pick and choose the parts you like. The whole structure is designed to be one coherent, indivisible block.
Why is that synthesis so important?
Because the entire point of the economic theory, the flawed LTV, the surplus value, was to serve a specific purpose. It was the bridge. It was the set of gears designed to connect his powerful sociological vision of history to the revolutionary outcome that the prophet in him demanded.
So the economics wasn't just about explaining the economy. It was about proving the historical necessity of its collapse. It was about showing how capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction.
That was its entire raison d'etre.
Right.
And this leads to what Schumpeter sees as the great intellectual tragedy of Marx's work, the trade-off. He argues that the economic theory was deliberately bent out of shape. It was narrowed and warped to make sure it produced the right answer.
The answer being revolution.
The answer being revolution. To get that result, he needed pure, unrelenting antagonism between just two classes. So he had to ignore or dismiss any economic principles that might, soften that conflict.
Like the role of other factors of production, or the existence of a middle class, or the possibility that innovation could raise wages and profits at the same time.
He had to push all of that to the side. In Schumpeter's view, Marx essentially sacrificed analytical honesty for the sake of his historical determinism. He knew the conclusion he wanted, and he built the economic machine to get him there.
That's a profound critique. It's not just saying his math was wrong. It's questioning the whole scholarly enterprise.
It is, and it allows Schumpeter to deliver his final two-part verdict. It's so elegant.
Okay, let's hear it. First, the verdict from the court of pure theory.
From the standpoint of technical economic analysis, Schumpeter says the verdict is unqualified failure. The apparatus is inadequate, the logic doesn't hold, the conclusions don't follow.
Ouch. But then there's the other side. The enduring achievement. Where does Schumpeter find value?
In the vision, in the methodology, in what he calls the historic raisonné. Schumpeter argues that Marx was the first great economist to make his entire theory a theory of historical analysis. He was obsessed with the process, the dynamics, how the economic system itself drives social and institutional change from within.
So Marx's great contribution wasn't a specific theory, but a way of thinking about economics as an evolutionary dynamic process.
Yes. That relentless focus on the internal logic of capitalism's development. That's what Schumpeter saw as brilliant and timeless. And that admiration, believe it or not, leads him to his most radical, most shocking conclusion. He says that if you take the deep, mature structure of Das Kapital and you strip away all the revolutionary slogans, all the political phrases, what you're left with, he says, admits of interpretation in a conservative sense.
Wow, okay, wait. How can the Bible of world revolution possibly be interpreted as conservative? What on earth does he mean by that?
He doesn't mean conservative like a political party. He means it in the sense of the system's logic being, well, conserving. Marx showed that the process of capital accumulation follows a strict, orderly, necessary evolutionary path. It's not just random chaos and greed.
It has his own internal logic.
A very powerful internal logic. So, Schumpeter suggests maybe the end point of that powerful, orderly logic isn't a violent, chaotic explosion. Maybe the end point is just the next stage. A managed, highly concentrated, super efficient system.
So not a revolution, but an evolution into some kind of massive corporate or state-run capitalism that's stable, not collapsing.
Exactly. A conservative result in the sense that the system matures and transforms rather than self-destructs. The logic of the process itself dictates a kind of managed stability, not the communist paradise Marx foresaw.
That is the ultimate critique, isn't it? To say your analytical structure is so powerful that it actually proves the opposite of what you intended.
It's the highest form of intellectual respect, in a way. He's saying the method is so good it can survive even its creator's intentions. The historical analysis is the real legacy, not the prophecy.
Which makes Schumpeter's essay so valuable for us today. It teaches you to separate the outdated economic machinery from the profound historical insight. You can learn from Marx's method without buying into his conclusions.
It's the essential filter. It helps you focus on the big questions about historical dynamics instead of getting bogged down in century-old debates about the labor theory of value.
And so we end with that final provocative thought from Schumpeter. If Marx's deep analysis of capitalism's internal logic, stripped of its revolutionary dressing, really does carry a distinctly conservative implication, what does that tell us about the future?
It forces you to ask the question, is the logical end of capitalist evolution a violent collapse, or is it just ever more rational, concentrated management?
A question that feels more relevant than ever. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Marx through the eyes of Schumpeter. Join us next time as we continue our journey through 10 great economists.